Eric, we are joined once again with the Creatine Kingpin. Dr.
In
Darren
all his
Candow.
glory, we have the Walter White of creatine back on. He's still managed to evade police. I think while we can all agree that COVID is a tragedy, one thing it has prevented is his capture. He's been able to stay under the radar as the world has been in turmoil, still peddling that white powder. And he came out of hiding, folks, to talk to us.
Yeah, as we understand it, Dr. Candow, you can't currently reveal where you are. We just have to say you're somewhere on Earth, ?
That is 100% correct. It'll be, maybe we'll reveal it at the end of the podcast where I'm located.
Well,
Secret.
I'm glad we could say that, and we'll just let it hang in the air, because we are looking to the Don himself for a little bit of business advice, because you've managed to establish a creatine empire, and myself and Eric are fledgling podcasters who denied the corporate overlords the ability to control us, the corporate cabal. Won't name what the company was. They were going to offer us something, and we said, we don't like money. We prefer for it to be available everywhere. Clearly, every single agent we spoke to said this is an atrocious idea. This only happens one time. Who do you guys think you are? Joe Rogan. I said, who's that? I thought his name was Joe Rogaine. It was a whole thing. Anyways, what I was thinking about, and I want you to answer this because you met my sexy co-host. I had to throw that in. Eric, let's just move on. You met him in person. And I want you to try and evaluate which of the following podcasts in our category would best complement some of Eric's qualities. Because basically, so Darren, here's what works. Just real quick. We'll just take a minute for this, and then we'll move on to the very important topic of creatine, of which, I'm a huge advocate. I've been proselytizing in the wilderness like John the Baptist. We already know this. We're going to get to it. But this is true. The truth. We're in the health and fitness category of Apple iTunes. We do rank routinely in the top 200 out of the 200 podcasts, Darren, in health and fitness. This is I'm being dead serious here. Only about 10% are actually fitness related, even maybe tangentially. The other ones, I'll read a few of them. So we're trying to expand. I am the pimp sending out my best product to go ahead, have those conversations, bring them into the cult. So I'm going to name some of these podcasts. You just let me know which of the following you think Eric would crush. I think you'd crush all of them, but just let me know. So the first one is Sex and the Sydney. I say this one because it's based in Australia. I assume that would be a hop, skip, and a jump for Eric. Of course, it's a sex-related health and fitness podcast. What do you think about that one?
Totally destroy it.
Okay.
Number one.
Okay. Fantastic. Yeah, that's what I thought. It's also not it's a short jaunt over for Eric. This one popped up on my recommended feed. I don't know how we got it from Iron Culture, but it's ADHD for smart-ass women. Again, I don't know. I don't know.
Eric could have a small contributing role, maybe in the gym somehow. I'm not sure.
Yeah. And then this one here, the Paleo Tribal Warrior podcast. I don't know how they're able to have internet access and talk about these things, but
yeah,
look at Eric.
I see you having a huge role in all three of those, actually.
Okay, good. And then the Carnivore Plane.
Yeah, you could be either the muscle, the brains behind all that, or maybe talk some sense into them. I don't know. Maybe I could see you relating all of it.
Lastly, Eric, go ahead.
Okay. You go ahead. You go ahead. Say the last one.
Final one. It's ranked number 16, and it's almost 30. Is the name of the podcast.
Wow.
So,
and these are actually legitimate podcasts?
These are at least 50% of what I just listed. Yes. I'll let everyone figure out which ones are which.
Oh, wow.
I love it. So as a pescatarian male who doesn't have ADHD,
right,
living in a different country than even the close one you're talking about,
right.
I don't see how this collaboration couldn't go perfectly. Honestly, I think we pitch them all, and then we just say yes to anyone who says yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Darren, I just think he has universal appeal because everyone I've introduced him to, which is only one other person, instantly fell in love with him. So my sample size, and that's we're going to talk about statistics and how it's very important to collect a sample size. I understand these things. So I introduced him to my friend, my videographer, Aus Habibi Hummus. And he said, and I quote, this is a true story. He said, Eric is my favorite guest you've ever brought over. So I think he has curbside appeal. We could get into it anyways. Eric, go ahead. You know me. I could derail this thing. You told me off air. I forget what you said. Go ahead.
Well, we would like to welcome Darren Candow back on to talk about creatine. I think that was a perfect segue. One led to the next without any issue. And anyone who disagrees, hit stop right now. Delete this podcast and never listen again because we don't want you. No, but in all seriousness, it's awesome to have you back on, Darren. And I think last time you did a great job introducing us to the topic and helping us understand really the breadth of things that creatine can do, the effects, and how it, honestly, I'd say it stands in a tier alone, at least for resistance-trained individuals, as the best supplement. While caffeine has just as much research, there are potential issues when you take caffeine, like if you work out in the evening, is it worth it? Also, we are yet to have a high-quality longitudinal trial showing the beneficial effects of caffeine. So I think caffeine is someone who thinks they're going to be a contender in the lifting world, but in reality, they're just in a whole other class. So with that said, despite the fact that creatine sits atop the tier list of supplements for the lifter, there are still a number of misconceptions which just will not die, despite the fact that it's been almost 30 years of creatine research. Shout out to that podcast. I'll be on anytime you want, if you're real.
That one is.
Okay, awesome. Not that you need a podcast about being 29. That's so stupid. I mean, I would love to be on. Please have me there. I'm 38.
Brandon,
I fit the
delete that
demographic
3-second
perfectly.
segment. We desperately
Yes.
need this. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll cut that out. So, Darren, I have seen someone taking creatine who has male pattern baldness. Therefore, scientifically, it causes baldness. Accurate statement or not? Your thoughts?
Love the question. You know, it's funny. After the last podcast, would say it's still the number one question we get. And the International Society of Sport Nutrition came out with that position stand, and I sort of got just so many questions. So I assembled a team, and we sort of wrote the myths and misconception paper. And it even is probably more popular than the question, does creatine destroy your kidneys and liver? Very similar to protein. And ironically, it still goes back to that symbol study in rugby players where they loaded them with 25 grams of creatine a day for 7 days and then reduced it for about 5 grams a day for 14 days. What's not highlighted is, of course, these individuals who started creatine had 25% lower resting values of a hormone called DHT, or dihydroxy testosterone. So the theory is testosterone is converted to DHT, and then, of course, that's been hormonally linked. The key word there is linked to hair thinning and baldness. And if people have seen me before, I'm not the greatest example because I have male pattern baldness.
Because you shave your head out of choice, and you could have an
shave
afro
my
if you
head,
wanted.
exactly.
Yes.
So again, correlation doesn't cause causation. But ironically, the majority of researchers in this area are probably bald or thinning. So of course, we get on there and people say, well, I don't believe anything you say. But when you look at the data, man, it's crazy how one study has sort of transcended the number one myth regarding creatine supplementation. So specific results of this study, they did not measure anything to do with hair loss, hair thinning. They simply measured serum levels of this hormone, and it was elevated with creatine, but the ironic thing is it all fell within the normal physiological range. It's no different than your range of cholesterol or blood glucose. You have a safety range and a higher range, and it all fell within these ranges. So at the end of it, people just said, oh, creatine causes baldness. And of course, it was hard to refute because there's only been one study. Nothing has been shown ever since. And so all we can say is there's no evidence, like I can't stress this enough, there's no direct evidence that creatine causes hair thinning or baldness. I think it got so important that I believe Dr. Grant Tinsley is actually doing a study. I saw one of his social media posts about 6 months ago. And I think he's actually going to measure hair thinning and follicle number to sort of put this to the rest. If his results come out and say, geez, yeah, we actually found data to support this, well, then maybe we would consider it. But I still say it's probably the number one myth. There's no scientific evidence that it does cause male pattern or a baldness.
So let me just, I want to frame the way this is caught fire in the evidence-based community for everyone to listen. So study comes out, like Dr. Candow said, They look at hormonal changes in response to creatine, and they find that DHT does increase. Now, that's it. There's, like you said, no measuring of actual baldness or increases in hair loss. The I read research and I have some evidence-based credentials. Level 1 response to that. And this is level 1, okay? And this is I haven't heard much beyond this. Is hey, that's an interesting thing we need to investigate further. However, we're looking at a mechanistic outcome rather than an applied outcome, and it's only one study. So that's the level 1 critique. And honestly, I haven't seen anything go beyond deeper than that. And I think it's really important, Darren, what you talked about in the paper that you published about this specifically, where you pointed out that, yeah, like I said, it could be sampling variance. And more importantly, that the change might not even be meaningful if it didn't go outside of the physiological range. Because it's not incorrect to say that high levels of DHT are associated with male pattern baldness and likely are a causative effect. Like, we know that the most effective hair loss prevention drug, Propecia, which is finasteride, it has a dose-dependent effect on suppressing DHT, and like I said, it seems to have a very direct effect on preserving hair loss and slowing that pattern, or even completely suppressing it, or sometimes resulting in hair regrowth, depending on when it's actually used. So anyway, and don't ask me why I know so much about that. And anyway, I think that was probably a more salient point than the initial one of just saying, hey, it's mechanistic, it's only one study, we got to wait for further data. While that is true, I think actually looking at the numbers and digging into the actual changes and the baseline levels is something that most people just haven't done. So I thought that was a really cool thing to read.
Yeah. It's so prevalent that no matter what we publish on creatine, you'll notice on social media or whatever, they don't care about the results. You could say we cured cancer. They immediately say, I thought creatine caused baldness. Like, that's all people care about it. It's probably very, very similar to the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. Like, you could say, no, it doesn't work, but then all of a sudden people say, no, this is, so it's getting the evidence out there and trying to change people's minds. But it's taken over now as the number one question, in my opinion, that I get almost on a daily basis. Like, I was losing my hair way before I started creatine, but yet someone would say, well, you take creatine, so the correlation and cause of effect it's just not there yet. And of course, they only had, I believe, 14 individuals, and it's a low sample size, and it was male dominated. It didn't include female. So there's a lot more research to go. So that's why that actually was the momentum or driving force behind that position stand paper. We sort of took the top 12 or 14 questions that I thought we got the most, and sort of taken it from an evidence-based perspective. Yeah.
Well, the only thing I actually paid attention to in all that was that creatine cures cancer, which is great news for the cult. So it's good to hear that we're dispelling all the myths and replacing them with the accurate information here, Dr. Candow. So I appreciate that.
Email about that later or something.
Hey, I was going to say, Eric, that Darren, unfortunately, I got to make the social media comment, because I don't think we can have this conversation without mentioning it. And I'm not going to throw anyone in particular under the bus. I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But there are some individuals when that title, because it is a salacious headline, when we think about it, one, it provokes that fear response. A lot of individuals that tend to take creatine are young males, aspiring lifters. And so that is a legitimate concern for a lot of men, right, to lose their hair, as you said, which I found that funny. Let me just say out loud. Kidney damage, like, just on the start, you know nothing about creatine. You're just like, oh, it could like permanently wreck your kidneys. That is horrendous to me. Like, that is scary. Just on the surface, you know nothing. You're not even a lifter. You just hear like, could creatine cause? That is genuinely scary. The fact that it has been replaced by, which again, there are social, I understand, but one, permanent, irrevocable, potentially change to like your daily functioning, and the other one, like, hey, you don't have hair up here, whatever. What I was going to say is that there are a few people who propagated on social media, prominent figures that I would call, Eric knows this term that I'm going to use when I'm going to say they're science adjacent. So people that are in the fitness community that leverage sometimes science as a marketing tactic, I'll say, to be honest, have essentially popularized the conversation around balding associated with creatine use. And
Right.
their overall stance on it, because their interpretation wasn't even, as Eric said, a level 1, it's like a level 0. And it was almost
Yeah.
nebulous with the like, well, we got to wait and see. This could be alarming. We think also about the mechanisms within social media. Eric and I have experienced this now with Iron Culture and everything else. A juicy title, more clicks. These titles on YouTube and such places, like creatine causes baldness, and then they do as a thumbnail, someone like them with hair, and then them Photoshop with their hair off because they know it's going to get more clicks. And I'm telling you, Darren, like this is crazy. The downstream effects where it has 400,000 views. These kids aren't any more informed. In fact, they're less informed than before, thanks to this juicy headline, this person that's not adept at conveying this information, and now really muddies the water. So unfortunately, I think, man, because there was that study and some people saw it as almost a marketing opportunity, it really has been blown out of proportion. And now you have young kids who are disproportionately scared about something that is really no concern to them or of consequence. So I just had to say that, guys, sort of real quick.
It's interesting because you guys are legit, science-based, reliable, and you have over 100,000 followers each on just Instagram. And so you guys could say something science-based, and a lot of people are actually going to follow it. But there's a lot of people out there that have hundreds, if not millions of followers, and all it takes for them to put up a clickbait headline, and all those people will believe in it. I can't say names, but just the other day we had a researcher from a really prominent U.S. school, and everybody knows the name. It starts with H, and he was saying if you skip meals on a balanced diet, that's going to be anti-aging, but he didn't tell you it was in mice. So what is the first thing the average human does? Says, well, you're at a really prestigious school in the world, I better stop eating. And then, of course, you get sarcopenia and osteoporosis and so on and so forth. So luckily, Alan Argon called him out a little bit or just put some context to it. And there's a lot of things that come up daily. I'm sure you guys get it from training to nutrition, and you guys have a huge platform. But it's amazing how the media and or things like that, if it's not done correctly, can twist words. And all it takes is one word sometimes to be twisted. And someone today you'll hear on this podcast, well, Dr. Candow said creatine cures cancer. And they just didn't hear the context of that sentence. And then
that it's only certain types of cancer that it cures. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we really should have clarified that. That's my bad.
Exactly.
I didn't jump in, guys.
Yeah.
So it is weird how, you publish a journal article, and let's be honest, they're kind of boring, the wording that the journal likes you to do. If you put this in a library with a $100 bill on the cover, it would be there 10 years later because no one does that. Everything is social media and instant feedback. And that's why like Twitter and Instagram has become so popular. But it's a dangerous platform, especially for people if they only read or misunderstand the context of the post. So that's why it's really good to keep doing these things and try to get the information out there, right? It's a really important service to the public. I mean, a lot of people could hurt themselves if they're not understanding what they're putting in their body or doing. So I agree. Yeah.
That's well said. And I think you're among those who are doing a service to the community, because I think a lot of the evidence-based community, and we'll not spend too much time on this so we can actually get to the creatine content, spends far too much time bitching and moaning about the pseudoscientists who propagate myths instead of assessing what are we doing. So we have all this content we're putting out that is being misinterpreted. And most of the time, I'm going to tell you folks, I know you love to point fingers and get mad and rally the horses. It's not done intentionally. I don't think that all of the quote-unquote bro scientists are out there attempting to mislead people. There is a small segment who are doing it when they have a product to sell, for sure. But most of the time, these are people who are in good faith misinterpreting science. So where does the responsibility fall? In my opinion, it falls on the scientists, the scientific community, and the people who are actually involved in research to do a good job of putting out the right information and communicating it well. And you, Dr. Candow, you're doing that. So you're on this podcast right now, and also very seriously, you mentioned how the scientific papers themselves tend to be relatively impenetrable to the average person. I would say on the scale of impenetrability, which sounds damn near pornographic, your article is one, it's open access, so it's in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition, which is also a very practitioner-focused journal. and it's a review titled Common Questions and Misconceptions About Creatine Supplementation. What does the scientific evidence really show? So it's actually a great example of how to write in a way that is accessible to most people and is high quality. And it is written in, of course, it's still scientific language, but I think it is very accessible. And it asks a question, it answers it, and it summarizes it at the end, and it goes through it all. So I think you're doing a great job. I think you're absolutely helping people understand this. So that's I would recommend everyone check that out. Just Google it. It's Jose Antonio's a lead author, and you can absolutely get a really good bead on a lot of this information and read the relevant research. So moving on, let's talk about some more of those myths. You addressed two in this, which I love, because to me they have always been like, you can't believe in both of these myths simultaneously. One, creatine causes dehydration. Two, creatine causes water retention.
Right.
Help me out here. How can they both be true?
So it's actually complete opposite. So let's start with the dehydration. I'm a big proponent of creatine monohydrate. I can't stress this enough. So anhydrogenous creatine that's produced in the kidneys is a creatine molecule, and creatine monohydrate is identical. It just has a water molecule attached. So when you consume creatine monohydrate powder, for example, the water molecule easily dissolves, and then when creatine leaves your small intestine, gets in circulation, goes to your liver and released in the bloodstream, it's identical to what's made in the liver. But the magic of creatine has been well shown that when you consume dietary creatine in the form of supplementation, and I think that's what the viewers are really focusing on, water gets into your muscle cells, but as it does that, it drags extracellular water to become intracellular. So a lot of times people say, gee, I took creatine and I gained some mass early. I almost want to give them a high five. I said, that is phenomenally good. You're a responder. You're going to probably get a lot of benefits. And they're like, whoa, I thought this just led to water retention. I said, all the magic you hear about creatine, increasing insulin-like growth factor, satellite cells, transcription, whatever, the water swelling of the cell is probably causing almost the entirety of those processes. So an increase in water retention in the muscle doesn't dehydrate you, it superhydrates the muscle. And as we know, your muscle is about 75% water. So the more water in there, there's more surface area to the muscle. So the theory is protein synthesis, all those magic pathways would go up. So a lot of people think you dehydrate or get cramps from creatine supplementation. I argue it's the complete opposite. You've superhydrated the muscle inside. So I don't see any issues when bodybuilders are cutting because it's intracellular. There's some, and you guys would know a lot more about that than me, but I think it could be advantageous when they're on a lower calorie diet or maybe a reduced energy balance. It could add in some energy. But I see and argue that it's a hyperhydrating substance. It's highly dragging water or supplementing it in intracellular. The acute water retention that a lot of people experience typically is during the loading phase. And that's typically where we take 20 grams a day for about 5 to 7 days. That's about 8 to 10 times more than what we're naturally producing. So yeah, you're probably going to get an increase in net water, but do we ever see the magic of creatine increase or be stimulated in the presence of cell swelling? So I argue, and the paper does it really elegantly as well. Dr. Darren Willoughby and Scott Forbes sort of handle that section. They actually suggest and do a good point of the opposite. And so that sort of parlays into the next one. Intracellular water retention is really beneficial. The cramping or some of these anecdotal effects that we hear about people taking super physiological doses of creatine, probably with high caffeine and some other supplements, that may be causing some of the disruptions. But if there is a cramp or spasm, it's typically at something called the sodium potassium pump. It's not probably due to the increase in water. So in my opinion, and based on science, I say it's actually the opposite.
Yeah, honestly, that's what I've always thought. I couldn't see how these two things could, or these three things, if we include cramping as well, could all, coexist. There has to be some of them that are totally false and some of them that have an element of truth and others that are accurate, but only in certain connotations like intracellular water retention, and then framed in the way that, oh, that's not a bad thing. So I think you did a fantastic job addressing all of that. Unfortunately, though, we've got to load creatine, and that's what we all think. Like, so some of these, I think it's not uncommon. I'll put this out there that during the creatine loading phase, people do experience some side effects. At the very least, a little bit of gas and some bloating. And when you think about it, if you're taking 3 to 5 grams a day, you're getting a total of about 30 grams in a week of creatine. We're talking about taking 2/3 of that every day for a week. So just kind of think about that conception, and that there's only so much you can store, so there's going to be some potential issues with that. So talk to me. What are some of the normal side effects that do occur during the loading phase, and is the loading phase necessary, beneficial? Is the juice worth the squeeze? Also, we need to talk about whether or not creatine is a juice, because I've heard you need to cycle it. But let's first just talk about the loading phase.
Yeah, so the loading phase is probably the most popular. It was originated by Dr. Roger Harris, seminal researcher in creatine in 1992. He simply showed that a human like ourselves, if you take 20 grams a day for 7 days, it completely saturated our muscle ability, or stores in our muscle. And so everybody has some variance, but on average, we can store about 160 to about 180 grams for applicability reasons. So the theory was, if you take a super physiological amount, 20 grams a day, that's a really effective way to load the muscle. So a lot of supplement companies and athletes said, hey, let's just do this, and that's the only way. The downfall, though, is over time, and you see a lot of studies, they're starting to see that loading phase was really effective for increasing muscle mass, strength, power, and things like that. But a lot of times you would see people say, I gain a lot of water retention or weight that it wasn't applicable or of interest. And then some people complained about GI tract irritation. So the way we preface this is we naturally synthesize, if you're on an omnivore diet where you consume red meat or seafood a day, probably about 2 to 3 grams. So we're synthesizing about that per day, and it travels in our blood to our muscle or brain or testes or other areas. But we also excrete about 2 to 3 grams in something called creatinine. So sometimes you've gone for a blood test and your medical practitioner will measure blood creatinine. It's an indirect measure of kidney function. So the average person, if you picked anybody in Toronto, New Zealand, wherever it is, and just looked at those metabolites, they're synthesizing about 2 to 3 grams a day and excreting it. So everybody's in a nice balance, no big deal. Research suggests that you probably need about at least 3 more grams a day to get muscle beneficial effects. So the theory was, well, can we do it through our diet? You can. You would probably need to eat about 1 to 2 more servings of salmon a day, 1 to 2 more red meat servings. Getting it from dairy is near impossible. So there's a lot of issues with ethical concerns of animals, cholesterol, I don't want to eat red meat, so on and so forth. So of course, a lot of people choose supplementation, which is usually vegan-based, no ethical use of animals. So a lot of people would consume this over time. What we found is that 20 grams a day is super effective. So let your listeners learn that's really effective. Do you need it? No, you do not. Eric Holtman in 1996 clearly showed 3 grams a day, like 3 grams, that would be half a teaspoon. Taken daily for a long period of time is just as effective as loading. It probably would take you maybe 3 more weeks to fully saturate the muscle. But the really cool thing with that, 0 adverse effects. So it comes down to context. If that athlete says, I really need a jolt or a boost really soon because I have a competition in 10 days, creatine loading would probably be the most advantageous. But I think the vast majority of the individuals listening would say, hey, I kind of heard about creatine. I'm taking it for health and longevity. 3 grams a day for the rest of their life should be fine. A lot of people do 5 grams because they say, hey, if you said 2 to 3 grams is excreted, why not take 5? And then you're sort of getting a net benefit. So 3 to 5 grams a day for up to 2 years, even 5 years has been shown to be effective. There was a study, I should point out, in individuals with something called gyrate atrophy. It was a retina disease. They were given 1,500 milligrams or 1.5 grams a day for a full year, and they even had benefits. So athletes, the average person, and disease state benefit. Actually, there isn't a type of human, including the embryo on the planet, that wouldn't benefit from some type of this metabolism. Even children, so we can get into that a little bit later. The alternative method that we like to use is a relative dose. So you know how caffeine is 3 milligrams per kilogram. We've sort of piggybacked on that idea that the larger you are, and so you guys are probably like, 180 to 200 and some pounds of muscle. So that's you guys, the theory is that the more muscle you have more creatine doorways or transporters. So Adam Persky did a really nice review in 2001 where he showed or theorized that the more muscle you have, the more creatine doorways you have. So maybe you can utilize more. So we've done this by 0.1 grams of creatine per kilogram. So for example, if you're 70 kilograms, you would get 7 grams a day. If you're 100 kilograms, you get 10 grams a day. It's no different, Eric, than your meta-analysis with Rob Morton looking at protein. 0.25 grams per kilogram for young and maybe 0.4. So I like the relative dose. I will say when we do that, it's super effective. And when we measure indices of kidney and liver function, no adverse effects whatsoever. So 3 of those strategies are super effective. And at the end of it, it seems to be the most effective, safest ergogenic or dietary supplement that you can put into a human physiology process.
So you said 0.04 grams per kg a day? That's the recommended dose of creatine if you're going to do it relative? Did I hear that right?
No, 0.1 gram per kilogram.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was sort of highlighting the dose of protein in your guys' meta-analysis. So some people say, hey, I take 20 grams a day. Well, I was like, well, at an older age, you might need more, 0.4. And Brad and Alan have looked at 0.6 grams. So it's all based on context. That's very specific. People say, I barely have time to work out. You want me to weigh all my stuff. So an average dose of 3 to 5 grams a day is good. You can creatine load, but after that, please reduce it down to about 3 to 5 grams a day.
So that 0.1 is for the loading phase, right?
So for creatine, instead of a loading phase, you can do 0.1 grams per kilogram, and that's just every day.
Okay. Because that's, is that skeletal muscle mass or total body mass?
Total weight. We have done some preliminary work on lean tissue, and that's stealing a bit of thunder. I have a study plan to look at an absolute dose versus relative and see if there is one that's better. Because you're right, the theory is if you have more muscle mass, maybe you can use more creatine.
Gotcha. Because 0.1 grams per kilogram per day would be like 8 or 9 grams
for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Correct. Now, that's a really effective way. Will 3 to 5 grams get you to the same level? Absolutely. It may take you maybe 5 or 6 days more. So it really comes down to it. I will point out, and we might talk about this study later, but now creatine is more medically based. Mm-hmm. And the minimum dose shown to have any bone benefits is 8 grams a day in older adults.
Interesting.
We think it's got to be way higher for cognitive function from a relative and consistent perspective because the blood-brain barrier doesn't like creatine because you actually synthesize creatine. So we're starting to see dosages range depending on the context of what the person's consuming it.
Gotcha. So if someone is, let's say they're young, they're taking it for performance and body composition benefits, you'd suggest starting with 0.1. Is that just, then you stay there as the maintenance dose, or would you then drop down to the maintenance dose?
Yeah, we've given that dose for 2 straight years to older adults, and it's been very effective. But you're right, once the muscle becomes saturated, could you reduce it? Yeah, you can. And that's with the loading phase. So again, for your viewers, remember, after 5 or 7 days of the loading, if that's the way you go, please reduce it to 3 to 5 grams daily. That's going to maintain your stores. If you do 3 grams a day, the lowest dose, you can do that till you're blue in the face, and it'll eventually get to the same results. Please note that's just from a muscle beneficial effect. That's not the same for bone or cognition or if you have a medical disease. So is taking more creatine harmful? No, you would just excrete it. And just like protein, I think you want to be on the higher end, making sure you're getting enough. And we think creatine is easily able to be consumed in a diet and or through a supplementation form.
Yeah, and just to reiterate what you said about how back in the 90s it was shown that low dose can be effective. That's actually been repeated multiple times. There's a study by Yanez Silva in 2017, Rawson in 2011, and then just recently in 2018, Neto and colleagues showed that 3 performed just as well as 5 grams. And within a couple of weeks, you're starting to get ergogenic benefits.
And we don't know, like, again, that simple study did 1.5 grams per year in a disease state. We haven't actually looked, can 1.5 grams do it? I don't see any reason why it wouldn't. It might just take you 45 days to load. So it
Right.
comes down to the preference. If you're taking more than you're excreting, it's eventually going to accumulate. However, is 1.5 enough to get through circulation and cause those effects? We don't know. I'm more interested in maybe we need higher amounts. Maybe when we get older, as the body's breaking down, just like aging anabolic resistance with protein, maybe we need more per serving. Those are questions we still need to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think while it's not probably a huge issue for most people because creatine is very affordable, like you mentioned, for those who weren't aware, creatine is made in a lab very cheaply. It is a vegan supplement in 99% of cases, as far as I'm aware. And it's, like I said, it's pretty cheap. But if you were to just take a maintenance dose from the start, a 500-gram tub of creatine is going to last you like 4 months. If you went through a traditional loading phase where you're taking, a full week at 20 to 30 grams, you're looking at cutting a month off the time of your creatine supply. So you're getting basically a 25% increase in cost for arguably, like you said, since it's created in the body, regularly excreted, it's not a hormone. I don't even think we need to bust that myth to the cult. They know that. We've got studies of people taking it as long as 5 years regularly. This is something that I've taken since 2004 nonstop. I haven't stopped, So did I get a benefit from loading back in 2004? Yes, but it is some amount that cannot be quantified and absolutely doesn't matter. So I would encourage people just to think about, if you're taking enough to get side effects, lower the dose. If you're a broke college kid or just don't have a lot of money, lower the dose. Don't do the loading phase because it'll save you some cash. But I think it's really interesting that some of the potential clinically beneficial effects on bone come at a higher dose in older adults. And the last couple episodes, duo episodes that myself and Omar did, we talked about how to stay at your top peak condition as you age as a lifter. So I would love to hear, what are we starting to uncover about creatine and bone, and how does that affect older adults?
Yeah, it's an interesting area. We kind of got into it by accident by looking at DEXA scans, and you're only concerned usually with lean tissue and fat. And then some of the initial studies said, geez, there was some preliminary evidence that maybe resistance training and the combination of creatine could have some potential bone beneficial effects. Regarding bone, though, and just like muscle, and I think we need to preface this, and I'm sure you can get very, very, very minimal benefits from creatine without exercise, and those would be extremely rare. But you get the most benefits, if not all, in combination with exercise, primarily resistance training. So again, those are the things that we try to benefit over time. But we were fortunate that we've done some clinical studies with creatine and exercising individuals, primarily aging individuals. And we just recently published a study in the Medicine, Science, and Sports and Exercise. So a couple of years ago, we showed that postmenopausal females, if they perform supervised whole body resistance training, they can get some bone beneficial effects. Creatine seemed to reduce the rate of bone mineral loss in the hip. And that's substantial because a lot of times when you fracture a hip, you're having increased physical inactivity, mobility issues, and unfortunately premature death, because inactivity at an older age can lead to obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and so on. And we were super excited to use a peripheral CT scanner, which looks at a 3D image of the bone in the limb. So we sort of measured this recently, and it published about 3 days ago, again, in Medicine, Science, and Sports and Exercise. And older adults, again, 50 years and above, males and females, when they performed whole body supervised resistance training for an entire year, 3 times a week, and they consumed 0.1 gram per kilogram of creatine, and that was about 8 grams for the average person, they got an increase or a preservation at the tibial shaft in the bone mineral density. So the muscle around the ankle, and more importantly, and probably surprising to me, is they got an increase in muscle density. So those muscles, the gastroc, soleus, and tibialis anterior, anything below the knee seem to improve. And so why is that relevant? Well, when an older individual may fall or slip on ice, and here in Canada that's coming soon, they may be able to withstand the sheer forces of falling or stop themselves from falling. And of course, as we know, 1 in 3 individuals over the age of 50 experience a fall annually. Some experience multiple falls. And falls definitely lead to fractures, premature morbidity, and unfortunately premature mortality. So this could have some clinical aspects for those individuals from a balance coordination perspective. The rate of change was small, but since we use some sophisticated technology, it does have promise. And I think I talked about this on the last show. We had that clinical study in 200 postmenopausal females. It started in 2013. It's done. And my colleague at the University of Saskatchewan is analyzing the data now. And he's let me know some preliminary results look extremely popular and beneficial from a bone density and strength perspective. So we hope to have those written up soon.
That's exciting.
The vast majority of studies with creatine don't show an effect because it just takes so long for bone to turn over. But if it's done with supervised training, a higher dose, so there's something we're looking at. These studies that have shown some promise have used about 8 to 9 grams per day, including on the days they're not training. So maybe bone requires more, or the synergistic effect of muscle pulling on bone. So there is some promise, which is super encouraging and exciting, especially for older adults prone to morbidity issues, balance, falls, and that could have enormous clinical significance.
2 comments. Actually, I'll say 3. The first one's quick. Awesome, very interesting, new information for me. And then 2 comments. You're dropping so much fire that it's being considered arson. And because they don't know where you are located, they're coming to both arrest and put out that fire where Omar is. We had to have him mute his mic because I could hear both police sirens and at least 15 fire trucks heading his way.
I heard that.
Man. So that was why you might have seen me throw my hands up, because I didn't know there were actually that many vehicles with sirens in Canada.
Coming there.
And then the third comment is, you're a researcher in the exercise science field when you need to mention the fact that it was published in MSSE, Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise, twice, because that's a damn hard journal to get published in, folks. High impact factor. They don't mess around. 3 reviewers most of the time, because 2 will never do, which just increases the chances of getting 2 pedantic reviewers, because you normally always get 1 at least, a reviewer 2, damn you. So yeah, lots of side stories going on here. But I think that's really interesting, Darren. I think most people don't consider the effects of creatine for bone. I know that's not something I've ever thought about before until we talked about it last time, and then now we followed up here. So I think that's really interesting.
And I should preface, like Bruno Gualiano and Hamilton Rochelle, they're excellent researchers in Brazil. They're some of the best clinical researchers in that area. And they've shown a study in 2 years of creatine at a really low dose, though. It was really low. I think it was anywhere between 1 to 2 grams a day. But the caveat there is they did not see any improvements. And the key is they did not have an exercise treatment arm. So again, I can't stress this enough. If you want any of these benefits, you have to train. You have to exercise. Creatine is like the icing on the cake. It's no different than protein supplementation. You still got to train. These are not anabolic steroids. These are just compounds or metabolites in food that can give you a small advantage. But yet in some populations, a small advantage could go a long way. So that's the key. Please exercise. The fountain of youth is exercise. It's got to be there to get these beneficial effects from proteins, the omega-3s, all this stuff. Yeah.
Beautiful.
I will say,
Omar,
Eric,
I suspect that you're going to be sitting pretty soon with all this new information. You didn't even know what you could push, what narratives you could push to keep your folks hooked.
What
and now you got more
demographics
ammunition
to expand into.
Yes.
I was just going after the youths, scouting different schools, universities, general rec facilities. But now I'm going to be going to old folks' homes and say, hey, look, all of you are going to be falling on average 1 time per year. And when you fall, it's going to get ugly. There is one simple supplement that you can ingest. This is a true story, though. I'll say this. I feel that the cult, there's not going to be a rapid uptick in creatine consumption amongst the actual cult because they're already hip and they're already likely supplementing with it. But for their
they're so
parents,
hip, they're not going to break a hip, Omar.
What is hip? Their hips, because it's, hip.
Yeah.
But of course, they may look and say, oh, I guess creatine cures osteoporosis and it'll definitely prevent me from falling. No, we're just showing it has some potential there.
Just cures cancer, folks.
Eric,
just
some
cancer.
cancers. Eric, some cancers.
Apologies.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
Man,
Before I forget, when we were talking about the loading phase, The other area we get a huge push is from females, and of course now the emphasis on the plant-based diets and vegetarians. So this is important because they're not getting any dietary creatine. It's found in red meat and seafood. So I will say, vegans and vegetarians, you do not need supplementation of creatine to live healthy, long lives. But my God, do you ever respond to creatine supplementation? So your intramuscular creatine stores are about as half as someone who consumes meat. And there's good evidence that when you consume creatine, it almost doubles the amount in your muscle, and therefore the muscles become potentially very energized. So I know a lot of individuals are emphasizing more plant-based diets. Supplementing with creatine could be considered something that may have some property or applicability to that person. It's not 100% necessary, but I will say the vast majority of evidence-based research suggests they do respond very beneficially. What we don't know, and this is the next line of thinking, vegetarians who, from a bone perspective, we don't know, can that overcome the negative effects or offsetting effects of not having creatine in their diet? Can that overcome bone density loss with older individuals? So there's probably 30 studies. I got ideas and plan. Once we get over COVID, hopefully the labs can reopen and people can volunteer again. But man, this has been researched forever. 1832 is when they discovered it, and I'll probably die researching this, and we still won't have all the answers. It's phenomenal.
Eric, I will say what I wanted to jump in. The uptick will be from their parents, the cult's parents. Likely, this is a true story. After our first podcast, I actually got my mom on the creatine, and she is back to benching 315. So, because afterwards we did a little bit of the research, saw about the dose.
Watch out, Jen Thompson.
Hey,
Get your own research. I like it. Yeah.
You know, Miss Frizzle, 4 reds. That's the goal right there. No one knew how much of a G Miss Frizzle was on that Magic School Bus, Darren. 4 reds, 220 kgs, like nothing, bench pressing. I do think one of the areas that is most interesting to me, because Eric and myself, we try and have a holistic perspective here at the Cult, is just some of the potential benefits outside of those of us that exercise look good or increase our performance. So it's like, wait a second, cognitive benefits here, or are we talking about for bone health? That to me is very interesting, because that is an age cohort where some of these things can make a dramatic impact. Maybe even for that kid. This is not a joke. I feel bad for him. So shout out to Luke if he still listens to this. That went to Fortis Fitness. Eric, he's 16 years old, a strapping young lad, and he somehow shattered. It was a spiral fracture of his tibia. He fell backwards, and he didn't fall. He caught himself, and somehow he stepped back, and it shattered his tibia. And I said, I don't know what your bones are made out of, but it's probably glass. Like, I don't know. So even he may be like, I don't know, man.
Wow.
Now, that's a perfect segue that we can use at the expense of Luke. Unfortunately, at the young age of 16, we know you can't take that there creatine. I remember when I was in high school, creatine was whispered, and granted, just to date myself a little bit here and show my age. This is around the time that Mark McGuire. Yes, definitely, and that lines up perfectly what I'm about to say, which happened in the late 90s. Mark McGuire admitted to taking creatine, but of course not anabolic steroids, which I wouldn't be surprised if might have been taking both. But that's just what I heard on the streets. And we were like, okay, well, we got to be careful about taking creatine. And, there's, I believe the NCAA, and I could be wrong, still restricts the coaches from providing creatine to their athletes because they're, just too young and impressionable. And it's obviously a gateway drug because it's, it's in chicken. Next thing that you start eating chicken. Next thing, heroin. So I think that's just the logical next step. So I think that rule should definitely still be in place. But obviously, Darren, we know this for a fact. As soon as you turn, 18, 19, 20, somewhere in there, all of a sudden your body will respond to creatine and it will not harm you. But prior to that, harmful, right?
Yeah, no. So there's a special issue in the journal Nutrients by Dr. Richard Kreider and Jeff Stout. They were the editors, and we've sort of all contributed to different areas, and Dr. Andrew Yagam and Chad Kursick and Stacey Ellery has even looked at it from pregnancy. So let's not even get into the child or adolescent or teenager. We're actually now seeing no reason, and I can't stress this enough, no reason that normal recommended dosages of creatine or even smaller amounts cannot have some beneficial effects to pregnant women, for the embryonic development, children into their development. It's kind of like saying children shouldn't lift weights, into adulthood, into late older age. I'm really hard pressed to find a human who can't benefit from this dietary compound. Remember, we naturally make this anyway. So to your specific question, and this gets come up a lot, the reason we're so hesitant with children and adolescents is because most research ethic boards require parental consent to do a research study in someone who's under the age of 18 in most countries. So a lot of times this area is just emerging. But in the minimal evidence and studies that have looked at it, there's no reason that children or teenagers cannot benefit in some way. The more important thing is we're not seeing any adverse effects. And it's not surprising. Again, the amount given is lower dose. They're naturally producing it. Unless a child had pre-existing kidney issues, dialysis issues, or liver abnormalities, we're not seeing any reason why they can't. I mean, asking a child to eat maybe 1 or 2 more servings of salmon would equate to the dose that they're probably taking. So as it stands right now, the evidence, we need a lot more. Obviously, we're probably more well-versed in people over the age of 18. But right now, the current body of evidence is suggesting that there should be no adverse or harmful reasons why a child developing, teenager can't take creatine. Again, it's naturally produced. So that's why the IOC will never be able to look at this. It's because it's in your body. It's impossible. So
I think that's obviously when there are more potential ethical issues with researching a given population, it is only natural that a side effect is there's less research on that population. So I think everyone can understand why, there's a lack of evidence, and therefore, of course, we're a little uncomfortable recommending something when we don't have the evidence to support the safety. Totally understandable, but also I think it really helps people to know that our body naturally produces creatine. It's in the food supply, and it has important actions on not just, muscle, but also bone, cognitive development. So I think I'm not sure the default position should be that it must be harmful. Of course, I'm not suggesting that we don't need more research, and you did suggest that. But I think that's really interesting, and I've always wondered where this specific fear, again, not even just around youth, but like college athletes, they're all adults. So what we're just assuming it's almost like it's going to lead to the wacky tobacco, and the next thing you know, they're in an opium den and they're hitching the train out to New York, and it's going to get crazy.
Yeah, I've heard the analogy. Is it any different than giving a child a glass of milk to consume after they do basketball?
You're a horrible person.
You're thinking, well, wait a minute, protein's naturally in the body. I guess creatine is too. You're supplementing the diet by adding a glass of milk. Is it any different? I mean, you could argue pros and cons of both. We're just not seeing any reason why creatine should be looked at any differently. To me, there's no reason. How is the age of 6 or 18 versus 19 any different? There's not. So some people are hesitant. I can see that for sure. You always want to err on caution, especially as we get under the age of maturity. But as it stands, when we look at evidence-based research, I'm not seeing any reason whatsoever that someone cannot consume or consider creatine supplementation.
Absolutely. And I think even more so now, and I think we touched on this last time, so we don't have to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I do find it ironic now that we're in the kind of the post-NFL concussion awareness of the world, now that we are starting to see the long-term effects of brain injury. Now we know that traumatic brain injury, TBIs, can be prevented to some degree, and even you can recover more quickly using supplemental creatine. And I do find it ironic that a university football coach is prohibited from providing that, creatine to their athletes. So I wonder how long that's going to stand, if, we're going to start to shift our perspective there or not. But it's an interesting thing that it can have very, important preventative effects in the current era we're in. So is there any more research coming out on the whole effect on brain health or brain injury prevention?
I would say it's exploding. It's really been taken off since the last podcast. We now have some preliminary evidence that it overcomes some aspects of sleep deprivation. So that's applicable for pretty much everybody. We're writing a review paper now on the effects of memory. We've shown that creatine by itself can have some cognitive effects. But of course, the issue with concussion, the tough thing there is you almost need to, from a true randomized control trial design, the problem with giving it to an individual who's already concussed is we don't know the rate of natural healing. So the way you'd have to do this, and I don't even know if an ethics board would ever do it, is you'd almost have to take a group of athletes, give them, assess them baseline, start randomly assigning them the creatine and placebo, and hope they get a concussion. Yeah. That's kind of how you need to do it. So we obviously there's many issues with that. So then they look at the animal model and so on and so forth. Where we're getting is it has so
that's not okay, but let's give animals brain injuries.
let's slam that mouse against the wall. That might sound
terrible, but it's such an important area for mild traumatic brain injury, concussion, and then of course where are we at with Parkinson's, Huntington's, ALS? I mean, these are huge medical and neurodegenerative diseases, but the issue is we're starting to see, can it help with dementia and Alzheimer's and depression? So there's some preliminary data to show that in all those areas, creatine could have some beneficial effects. And then we're looking at stroke rehabilitation. Now we have a paper in review, but all those areas are so in its infancy. The problem with the brain is it can actually synthesize some of its creatine. So it's kind of resistant to supplementation, even diet. So the theory is we might need a lot more to get across the blood-brain barrier. So now maybe some studies that are looking at maybe 10, 15 grams a day, almost going back to the loading phase, but that could be from a preventative or medical situation. And then the idea, Serge Osadek is looking at guanidino acetate, these precursors for creatine, can that upregulate brain function more? So I'm really excited about this area. From the neck up, I don't think we ever would have thought an athlete supplement that was designed and got precedence in the 90s from Linford Christie won the gold medal is like, oh, you're on creatine, then it sort of exploded. To look at something from the neck up, which is way more important than the size of your bicep per se,
let's not get ahead of ourselves, Darren.
Don't get crazy. But imagine, so if you say, okay, the neck up and then low, it could have, we're looking at a whole body beneficial thing in theory. Yeah. We know the benefits with exercise on cognitive function. So we're pretty excited. And I would say the next 20 to 30 years, the majority of creatine research will probably focus on the neck up. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I could absolutely see, prospective cohort studies in like combat athletes and contact athletes where, you get a big group and you give some a placebo and you give other groups, creatine. And if they were already not planning on taking creatine in that placebo group, which you can also, there are study design methods where you can ensure that you're not really depriving someone of an option. And of course, anyone can leave a study at any time. And then you look at the occurrence and the severity of brain injuries over time. I think that would be an amazing study to conduct. For all I know, it probably already is being done. But I did not know, and I think it's really interesting that you talked about that you might require another instance of a higher dose to actually have a measurable impact on the brain. So is that probably along the same lines as what you might need to get those bone type of benefits in the elderly?
Yeah, it could be. I know astrocytes in the brain kind of don't like creatine. They sort of block it. So the theory is we might need more, or you could probably do a lower dose, which we talked about, but you may need for months and months and months to get across this blood-brain barrier a lot. And so some of the studies have looked at low dose. We're not really seeing a lot, but then when you look at the high dose, it seemed to have some potential. And then, you sort of trigger my brain when you talk about mixed martial arts, but, what about world champion boxing? The Fury fight the other day is like, I highly doubt one person say, hey, I want to load with creatine beforehand and then measure brain indices after. And then the other component says, okay, I'm willing to go on placebo. I don't know if they're going to do that. But it would be interesting in the UFC and mixed martial arts and head contacts such as professional boxing. Maybe that's a way to sort of look at the effects on brain, record how many punches to the head and see the effects over time. And would creatine potentially speed up brain recovery and the swelling on the brain that can happen? I have no idea about Muhammad Ali and how the blows to the head with Parkinson's and stuff, but we'd probably be crazy to think it wasn't correlated, right? So trauma and hits to the head, and then of course NFL, CFL, rugby, Australian rules football, the hits to the head are just, it's crazy, the forces. And if creatine can have any benefit, we really got to look at that. And I think government funding agencies really got to look at that. How can we really improve indices from the neck up? And if the neck up is healthier, everything else is going to be healthier. Those people will eat better, get better sleep, exercise more, and decrease overall healthcare costs. So super excited to see where this goes, and interested to see some clinical studies. Rodent models can help, but we need to do it in free living humans to really understand where this is going. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. And Omar, this is good news for you as this shifts forward. You're talking about expanding your market to the older individual. But let's be honest, the problem with old individuals is they're going to die really soon. So if you start marketing to them, you're looking at the income per unit of time is actually quite low. Right. Yeah. However, now that we've just established that we're seeing benefits in pregnant women, getting them hooked in utero, and then that we can potentially get this in the hands of adolescents and young people, we're talking about a lifetime profit per customer that is going to skyrocket. So as much as I think it's, you're not going to stop an older individual. Now, the context is we're trying to hook people on something that is definitely a drug and not naturally produced in the body and not beneficial. That's the context. Thank you. So I think getting them hooked in utero and then making sure that you get these kids on it as soon as they're out of the womb as well, that's the way that you're going to maximize your profit model, Omar. So elemental formulations, this is a new era for your creatine sales.
Darren, they refer in marketing to customers their LTV, lifetime value. And as Eric correctly pointed out, that the elderly, their lifetime value isn't that high. But if we can get them addicted from a young age in utero, I mean, just think about all the squizzle we'll be making. I will say, I can imagine, unfortunately, because the very reputable Mayo Clinic did come out on their website, it is listed, there's things they don't recommend for the impressionable youth, right? Because they're irresponsible. Anabolic steroids, right? PEDs, not a good thing. Ish don't think so. They're still developing. We understand. Right below that was creatine monohydrate for its, deleterious effect. I don't know, but it's on the website. Parents are observing it. I could only shudder to imagine the horror that could probably ensue from this episode from our young, impressionable segment of the Iron Cult, their parents layering over them, listening to this episode. We are going to get probably picketers, Eric, wherever they think our headquarters are, which I am flattered they think we can afford headquarters. But wherever it is, where
just follow the sirens, folks.
I know we're horse. Follow the sirens. Yeah, it's like what a mad like Mothers Against Dangerous Drugs. This time it's gonna be for creatine. They're gonna be yelling out loud, "Oh my God, I don't want my son to be a muscle-bound hunk. What do you think you're doing?" Right? So it's just gonna be this catastrophe. We're gonna have to appear on CNN and Fox News to remain politically neutral in order to correctly explain, but be poorly interpreted by whoever's interviewing us. So then it'll just more cascades will tend to occur, and before you know it, we will have no reputation to speak of by middle America, and we will basically be a band on the run.
Yeah.
Band on the run.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. I can't wait to sing it with you while we're hiding out.
That's how we get
I'm
caught,
excited.
Eric. That's how we're in a bush
Stop
somewhere.
singing. They're right there. And I'm like, no. This is my dream, Omar.
Harmonize with me. I'm like, oh, jeez. Oh, wow.
We found him singing underneath a turned over canoe somewhere in Ontario.
Yeah, we weren't found for years and years, and they just heard this 2-part harmony that was just crystal clear and majestic, ringing.
So bad. Yeah. Oh, yeah, no. So good.
No, so good,
yep.
so good.
Yep. All right. Well, I'm going to turn over canoe back on track. So we've established that a lot of the benefits of creatine come from maintaining high levels of creatine stores in the body. So I think it's an interesting thing that you can hear people who will acknowledge that, but then they will tell you that the timing of when you take creatine is utterly important. You got to take it post-workout. And those seem to conflict a little bit to me conceptually. If we are really just quote unquote topping off our gas tank, why would the timing matter, and does it? I would love to know what the latest research is on the timing of creatine dosing.
Yeah, that was a focal point for about 5 years, and me and Dr. Scott Forbes, we just published another study on this, and it's getting pretty conclusive that the timing of creatine supplementation in a 24-hour period is irrelevant. It's kind of similar to following the total daily amount of protein is way more important than the timing. Now, yes, protein pacing, taking meals multiple times a day is probably more advantageous than one meal. But what we're starting to see is that the total daily amount, or just getting creatine in, is probably the most important. So I'll just preface this a little bit. There was a couple studies, including some by myself, that have shown that pre-exercise creatine in an older population had some beneficial effects. And then, of course, post-exercise creatine supplementation also had some beneficial effects. And just this year, we sort of took away the branched chain amino acid phenomenon from people, and we replaced it with creatine. And so what this study did, my graduate student, Scotty Mills, we published it this year, we had individuals take a small sip of solution after every set. So they did 18 training sets. It was 6 days a week, pretty intense. But you know how people will usually drink branched chain amino acids throughout their workout session? We took that away. We mixed up 0.1 grams of creatine in a large shaker bottle full of water, and they had to consume 18 mouthfuls of the solution. So really, you were getting creatine after every set. The theory here is blood flow to the muscle, transport kinetics, so on and so forth. And what we showed, it had a substantial increase in muscle strength. So people read this and say, oh, I got to consume my creatine during exercise. That's the only way. And I'm like, no, all we did was we've shown that creatine before exercise is effective. Creatine during your training set is effective. Creatine after exercise is effective. It doesn't necessarily mean that the timing is. It means that creatine in combination with training is effective. What needs to be done is a study to look at creatine before, during, versus after to see if one is better. I don't think they would be, based on getting it into the muscle over time. It's not like caffeine where it gives you an immediate sort of a drug effect. It takes a little while for this to occur. Paul Cribb, if you remember that study, he looked at creatine in the morning and evening versus in close proximity to training. And yeah, it might be some small beneficial effects to consume it around blood flow or exercise-induced muscle contraction. But until we do pre-sleep creatine and other areas of the day, so the bottom line is, in this study that we just published, it was a within subject. So this was really powerful. We split the body in half. They trained their right arm and right leg and consumed creatine either before and then placebo after. And then on the left side, they consume creatine after, placebo before. We controlled age, sex, menstrual cycle, everything, because it's within the body. No differences. Like, both sides responded the same way. So we're concluding, and I think a lot of creatine researchers will say that the timing is pretty much irrelevant. As it stands right now, we're not seeing any reason that you got to dive into the locker room, consume it immediately, or you're going to deflate or not get the benefits. We're just not seeing that.
Well, it sounds like the only reasonable recommendation based on everything you said is to cover all your bases and take it pre, during, post, and before bed. Or perhaps, so what do we think about IV-based drip creatine? Is there an intravenous issue with creatine monohydrate mixed in water?
It wouldn't surprise me if we're going to do that next, but I think, to your point, I think taking creatine, there's a lot of viable strategies now, right? Maybe you're going to replace those branched chain amino acids because they're probably doing more harm than good for protein balance. Maybe you take creatine. Maybe that's the most convenient for you. We don't know pre-sleep creatine, the anti-catabolic effects. What if you only consumed it in the morning? So I got a whole series of timing or efficacy studies lined up. that come to it. I just think take it, exercise, and go on with your day.
Yep. One thing I would also like to see more research on, and this is actually going to be serious. I know I've managed to make a joke almost after everything you said, Darren. That's not even my job. What am I doing, Omar? I'm trying to steal your thunder. One thing I would actually like to see more of is more creatine research in the post-loading phase, because I think that's what 95% of people actually have questions about. Like me, I loaded back in '04, but is there anything I can do now in 2021 with my daily 3 to 5 grams that I could do different or that would make a difference? And my intuition, just based on the mechanisms and what data we do have, is it probably doesn't matter, but it'd be good to have the research,
So to that point, and I totally agree. What if your muscle got bigger?
It has.
Like, are you trying to tell me that 3 grams is the same efficacy as someone's muscle who got maybe 30% larger? My understanding is if you got 30% larger muscle mass, you have 30% more storing capacity of creatine. So maybe just like protein, trained individuals can utilize more protein. Maybe the trained muscle can utilize more creatine. So the other way to look,
I got to go from 3 to 4 grams. It's some big stuff I got to pull out.
Lifestyle changes.
And that's something we don't know. That's something we don't know. And the other idea that it still needs to be more, I can't believe this, but there's never been a study to compare, do you need the creatine load? In other words, do you look at creatine loading, then you come off for 4 weeks, then you go back on loading, or can you take a regular daily dose? We've only done 2 or 3 studies worldwide, and we think if you come off creatine totally, it takes about 4 weeks for those intramuscular levels to come back to baseline. In older adults, they seem to last a bit longer, but we've never put someone back on a creatine loading cycle. Eric Rawson's done that to just look at plasma in the muscle, but a training study, we don't know, should you load? So maybe you load, come off creatine, and then load again. Do you get a greater synergistic effect? There's theory that you might get an increased sensitization, but we just don't know. So I'm with you. It'd be interesting to look at the post-loading phase, or what happens if you did creatine loading and people took 3 grams versus 5 grams versus 8 grams. Is there a difference in the maintenance phase? So you basically give me 5 more ideas now for studies, and we'll try to come up with ways to look at it. Yeah.
We're going to have you back on for the next 10 years. It's going to be amazing. And I expect at some point you to have hair in the future. Just to stop shaving it. Just show them that you got the canned fro.
Yeah, in about 10 years, we'll probably be at a 50 gram of creatine a day, and it's solved all the world's issues. And of course, your readers or your listeners say, 50 grams a day now is good.
Absolutely. It reduces, political polarization. It eliminates poverty, all kinds of great stuff.
And to that point, I just caution to your viewers, the vast majority of research is always on monohydrate. There's a lot of other purported ones out there. I probably get about a couple of questions a day. All I'm going to say right now is there probably is other forms of creatine if it has creatine. So please make sure that the molecule that you're consuming is creatine first, because really it has to be absorbed like creatine. It has to get in the bloodstream, and then of course it has to get into the muscle. So there's a lot of scams and marketing out there. I would say the err on caution, just focus on creatine monohydrate. It's the most effective. The International Society of Sport Nutrition backs it. And we're revising that position stand from 2017. We hope to have it out next year before the conference to really emphasize some of the more questions that often get brought up. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, that's a great one. I think since we had our podcast last time, there was a study published by Fazio and colleagues. It was a systematic review on alternative forms of creatine, just kind of looking at their effects on performance and body composition in healthy subjects. And the overall findings, there has never been a study that showed any other form of creatine to outperform creatine monohydrate. And I think that's an important point because when you look at the marketing copy from supplement companies, they are normally suggesting that creatine is something that needs to be improved upon. We need to increase the solubility. We need to increase the bioavailability or something to that nature. But when you look at the data on creatine, there aren't issues there. We aren't struggling to reach creatine store saturation in a reasonable time frame. And as we talked about here, you don't even necessarily need to do the loading phase, and you can get saturated muscles and all the benefits, even just taking a maintenance dose after 2 to 3 weeks. So you have to question, like, when you see that marketing, like, are you really solving a problem, or are you creating a problem so I buy your product that now costs 5 times as much as monohydrate?
So creatine monohydrate, and this is so clear. Creatine monohydrate is easily absorbed, and it's almost 100%, maybe 99.999 bioavailable. That means almost the entire creatine monohydrate molecule is absorbed in the bloodstream. Can we say that with other purported scams? Probably not, because it's never been looked at. So my argument is, why would you ever take something that's not monohydrate when it's the gold standard, it's 100%? Why? I just don't know. Does the bottle look better? I have no idea, but please, for the listeners, just go by peer-refereed science. You're not going to get any better than monohydrate. If for some magical reason it gets in the system more, my question is, well, it better be creatine or it's not going to get in the muscle. That SLC6A8 transporter is specific, just like a lock and key to your house, to creatine. And that's what monohydrate is. So again, please don't get scammed, or just because it's purported, please go to the science before you spend a lot of money. Monohydrate is really inexpensive. Some of these other forms that are out there, and if they're not backed by evidence-based research, may not even have creatine in there. So again, they need to do their homework. And you can't go wrong with monohydrate. It may be boring because it's the original, but geez, you can't go wrong with it.
Yeah, on average, and this is actually in that systematic review, creatine monohydrate, if you're getting it from a non-certified product, if you want to get it from like a drug-tested product, if you will, it's 19 cents per 5 grams. If you want to get buffered creatine, it's $1.51. If you want to get creatine ethyl ester, it's 53 cents, which is still like 3 times the cost. If you want to get creatine anhydrous, 72 cents. Magnesium creatine chelate, 45 cents. So it's like all of them are at least a factor of 3 or 2 more expensive. And some of them, like I said, are a factor of like 8. So I think it really doesn't make sense why you would look at a product like creatine monohydrate that already has stellar bioavailability and solubility and go, you know what? I don't want 99.99% bioavailability. I want that 100%, and I'm willing to pay 700% more to get that insignificant increase that actually you have promised, but you haven't delivered because nothing has been proven to actually be more bioavailable than creatine.
And that's a good point. Like, if it got more in the system, which is, I see no evidence, it's still got to get in the muscle. So again, form and function, it has to be creatine.
Yep.
And then it has a function like creatine, and nothing will come close to monohydrate.
But I can understand the interest though, Darren, because I mean I remember when HMB free acid came out, and that theoretical increase in bioavailability, it was like people were taking D-ball, and all of that research is not suspect at all. So I don't understand why we couldn't expect the same thing.
And it's like, it's the marketing, right? Flashy gimmicks, and of course we're always trying to come up with new ways to make money. I just feel bad for the consumers who buy it, and they might be hurting themselves. We're not sure if you got to look at the safety of some of these products out there, and if it doesn't have the certified safe and the independently tested, it's an area of caution. So that's why creatine monohydrate, 100% pharmaceutical grade, you can't go wrong, and why mess with a good thing? I just don't see the validity or reliability behind anything else.
Yeah, and actually that's a really good point that I didn't even touch on. I was talking about the efficacy, but if you look at that systematic review, there were 17 studies in it. That means there's very little research that's actually looking at these other types of creatine, which means we don't have a well-established safety profile on them. And unfortunately, the way the largest supplement companies operate, being American companies, is that it's very much a post hoc assessment of when something's problematic. Of course, a smart company is going to do some initial safety testing, but that's not the way supplements work in the States, where it's like, hey, you have to show a safety profile before you go out there. It's more like we can pull it off if there's an issue. So,
yeah.
So, anywho, just do the monohydrate, folks. That's really the take-home message.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Omar, when are you coming out with your new creatine product that has better delivery, bioavailability, and solubility?
For children,
For
specifically
children.
targeted. So it'll be Flintstone creatine gummies. Probably 2023. Retail price TBD. We're still doing the market research.
Yeah, I think we're still working on corrupting Ben Escrow a little more because he's got these weird vestiges of a conscience, which we got to break him of that.
It's fleeting.
If he really
It's
wants
fleeting.
to be good.
Yeah, it's the remnants of something from a long ago past. Where sometimes you gotta just clean the board, have a clean slate. It's happening.
You could have it on your t-shirts now, like instead of this is your body on creatine, this is your child on creatine, this is your older adult on creatine.
I want to see a fetus just looking jacked. And that would be amazing. Next to one that's not, and be like,
Which one do you want?
Yeah. Do you want to have an alpha fetus or not?
Are you tired of your fetus getting sand kicked in its face? Like, come on, we got it, Eric. We got it. That's the number one mark.
Stacy's face right now. She's like, "That's not what he said. You can't put that out." Oh my god.
Oh, amazing. So yeah, that's direct quote from the studies. I love it.
Eric, we did. So some people accuse us that it's a top-down hierarchy, that you can't correct us, that we don't listen, that we're enclosed within our own vacuum, right, of truthiness. But we, in very real time, people can attest to this. People say that we correct what we say in episodes, and we thought at the start that creatine could cure cancer. And Eric, what did we find again?
Now we found that only certain types of cancer.
Certain
thanks
types.
to you. That absolutely real quote that you can rewind. Don't do it, but just trust us that you could rewind and you could hear Dr. Candow citing that study.
Yep.
Now, what I want to see is additional research on whether the claims that I've heard from some people that creatine can also prevent COVID. So I'd love to hear your comments on that, Dr. Candow. That's a pretty non-controversial topic. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh boy, I get this one a lot too. And like not even close. Like kind of like boosting your immune system with all. I was like, creatine is good from an exercise potential benefit. It might decrease some inflammatory markers after exercise, like cytokines and stuff.
Sounded pretty hopeful.
Serge Ostiak put out a perspective idea about maybe creatine can enhance recovery. The key is recovery, but geez, people, please don't, I've actually had people say, well, I'll just take creatine and not get vaccinated. And I'm like, I don't have any hair left. I just, it's no. The answer is no.
Okay. I'm glad you preempted my next question, because what you were saying was leading me to a natural conclusion that maybe creatine would be the better option than the vaccines. But I think... Yeah. I think we'll just leave it there. Obviously, we don't have the research yet, so people can decide for themselves. I'm definitely pro-choice. So,
wait, though, what's a cool idea is, for future pandemics and with COVID, I wonder, and we're seeing huge increases in the rate of muscle loss in young and older individuals because of COVID, gyms closed and all that. And if this keeps going on, we're going to try to get into at-home exercise programs for especially older people with rubber bands and maybe some dumbbells, and then randomize it. And can creatine offset the rate of loss? We've seen athletes, everybody. You guys have probably experienced it yourself when everything was locked down. How do you keep exercising, and is it safe to do? And I think with future pandemics or how long this goes, we really got to come up with some strategies to at least maintain muscle mass in disease state individuals, and come up with some alternative strategies. Maybe creatine can help maintain or give some benefits. It's kind of like omega-3s and protein and whatever, but that's an area that unfortunately, I think we need to look at. How long is this going to go, right? We're almost in 2 years. It's crazy. Like, we're making some progress, and then you look at numbers and it's different around the world. And just how do you maintain exercise, right? That's the key. Yeah. Absolutely.
No, I think that's, I'm always impressed that we can throw you some complete nonsense and then you make some good points out of it. That's when you know that you know how to roll with Omar and Eric. So I think you've done a fantastic job. We've covered a veritable plethora of creatine myths related to cramping, water retention, dehydration, the elderly, adolescents and children, even pregnant women, in addition to understanding the effects in a clinical setting for bone health, cognitive health, TBI. So I really like that we covered the breadth of topics here. We even touched on timing, dosage, loading, a lot of things that people are still yet to understand, and that future research is coming out. So at this point, Darren and Omar, of course, jump in if there's things you want to add. I just want to open the floor to you. If there's anything else you want to add that we haven't covered at this point that you think would be, a nice capstone to this discussion.
Yeah, I think the icing on the cake is creatine is not a steroid. It has some beneficial effects, maybe like creatine, because maybe you get bigger, stronger, faster. It's an organic acid. It's not an anabolic steroid hormone. It's not a steroid. That's the one we get a lot too. It's just not. It's not even in the same category.
So it sounds like you're saying creatine is not a steroid?
Not a steroid.
Okay.
Steroid.
I'll try to write that down so I don't forget it next time.
Don't write down creatine. You'll probably write down creatine is a steroid.
Well, I like to keep, I kind of have a way of taking notes now that I have got my PhD. Like I sign things poorly on purpose. I also do shorthand notes. So I leave out some unnecessary short words like not, I'll probably leave out is as well. Just put creatine steroid. I'll know what it means later and I'll get it right on the podcast. You just got to trust us. So
yeah, no, that's about it. But yeah, I still think there's lots to do in this area. And yeah, maybe we'll do this every year, a couple of years, and update and see how it goes.
The State of the Union on creatine. I think we need to do that. I love it.
I like it.
And I also like that you will be the permanently elected president of the creatine state. And I'm sure that election is definitely, approved by the UN. Nothing to worry about there, folks.
I'll grow my hair out for the next one.
Yes, I want to see you wearing, definitely having your own hair on camera. So people, we can dispel this myth that your balding is due to, well, even that it's balding, because we know that you purposely shave it. Creatine is...
Saves money. Like, I don't have time for this yet.
Absolutely. I don't know how you managed to do that on lockdown so well. But we won't even touch that. So, I just want to say thank you for being on, Darren, Dr. Candow, to put a little bit of respect on your name. Not too much. Don't want your head to get any bigger. That's probably why you shave it, just to keep it in the right proportions. But I think this has been awesome. This has been a great update. A lot of topics that I think even people who are well-read in the sports nutrition world will probably be intrigued by, interested, and will make them a little more apt to look for new creatine research on the horizon, because a lot of people think, oh, we know all we need to know about it, when in fact, really, we're just uncovering some of these clinical applications.
No, thanks for having me. It's been a blast. I love it.
Dr. Darren Candow, I will say that some listeners are perhaps relieved to know that in that theoretical concussion study, you're not going to encourage, it's not going to happen, and you're not going to basically actively encourage, players to get it. Instead, what we'll do is the far more sensible and ethical thing, which is just slamming mice against the wall after administering them creatine and seeing what sticks, their cognitive ability afterwards. So it's good to know that there are these rigorous ethical standards that allow us, Eric, what did we find out, 100 episodes ago, where whoever said, ablation, I didn't know what ablation was. And then Eric's like, oh, just explain to the viewer what ablation is. And we're like, oh, okay, right. So we're, yeah, these are the studies. Oh, I don't know, where they say, like, you always hear, like, oh, in the rodent study, or it's like, oh, they were swimming like that. What was the motivation one, Eric? Not again, like, we're going to end this episode right here. But it was the one about, I forget what they administered to mice, but they're swimming to their death. And the one that survived the longest, it was something that they were administered, but it was basically a swim to their death, but it wasn't phrased as such when you're reporting the findings. Anyways, I digress. Always a pleasure.
It's mice Hunger Games, basically. Yeah.
yeah. Like, I love how it's so ubiquitous in research that the way that you communicate it is that, like, that's not even the part that's communicated, because that's not the function of the researcher. Like, it's, of course they're going to die. I will say,
let's just say I would not have a PhD if I ever had to do animal research. I'll just put that out there.
Right. I want to thank you for being on. I do think people learned a lot, and I do think the new uptick will be not in the cult, but in those close to the cult, near and dear to them. So family members, loved ones, children, especially the youth. I mean, if the younger we could get them, come on, let's get after it. I want to thank everyone for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. You can go ahead and leave a rating and review on iTunes. It does help us out. We'll see when those collabs hit us, who Eric will be doing that collab with. Thank you so much. We'll catch you back every single Monday.